In Lakewood Church, Houston, a silent, aging martial artist was about to defy a sermon broadcast to millions. What began as a routine Sunday service turned deadly serious when the prosperity gospel met the courage of conviction. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical celebrity congregant. For decades, he had been a U.S. Air Force veteran, martial arts champion, and on-screen defender of justice, known for standing firm when others bowed to pressure. When Joel Osteen's message urged passive surrender, the preacher had no idea he was challenging a man forged by war and moral discipline. Chuck stood wordless but unyielding, sparking a chain reaction that would trigger a spiritual uprising broadcast live to millions. What began as a televangelist's polished sermon would become a confrontation between comfort and courage. The sanctuary of Lakewood Church would never be the same after one man refused to sit down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Light streamed through the vast windows of Lakewood Church, casting halos across the sea of expectant faces. 15,000 souls packed the converted sports arena, their collective energy humming beneath the cathedral-like ceiling. Camera crews lined the aisles, red lights blinking in silent countdown. This was no ordinary Sunday service. It was Joel Osteen's most anticipated sermon of the year, broadcast live to millions across the globe. Today is your day of breakthrough. Joel's voice glided over the congregation, smooth as polished marble. His perfect white smile flashed beneath the spotlights, arms outstretched in welcome. God doesn't send the storms to break you. He uses them to make you stronger. Applause erupted, washing over the front row where Chuck Norris sat motionless. Unlike the swaying, nodding crowd around him, the legendary martial artist and actor remained still, his weathered hands folded in his lap. At 75, his presence commanded attention even in silence. The crow's feet around his eyes had deepened with age, but the intensity in his gaze remained unchanged, watchful, discerning, measuring each word against a lifetime of hard-won wisdom. Chuck hadn't planned to attend. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier. A personal note from Joel himself, expressing how honored the church would be to host him. Chuck had nearly declined. After decades in the spotlight, he'd grown weary of being the celebrity guest, the photo opportunity, the famous face who validated others by mere proximity. Yet something pulled him here, not fame or obligation, but a quiet, persistent question that had haunted him through sleepless nights. Was there more to faith than comfort? From her position at the side of the stage, Sarah Osteen watched her husband work the crowd with practiced grace. After 20 years of marriage, she recognized every inflection, every gesture, every carefully crafted pause designed to maximize impact. Yet today, something felt different. Her eyes drifted to Chuck Norris, noting the stillness that set him apart from the enraptured crowd. There was weight in that stillness, a gravity that made her inexplicably uneasy. "My God doesn't want you to struggle," Joel continued, his Texas drawl warming as cameras panned across his face. "He wants you to surrender those burdens, to accept that every trial is just a stepping stone to your blessing." The crowd responded with enthusiastic amens and raised hands. Television screens magnified Joel's expression to cathedral proportions, his conviction beaming down like sunlight. Near the back entrance, Security Chief Eli Vega scanned the room with practiced efficiency. Former Marine, 5 years with Lakewood's security team. He knew the rhythms of these services, when to expect the emotional peaks, the moments when someone might faint from fervor or rush the stage in religious ecstasy. His gaze paused on Chuck Norris. Something about the man's posture triggered Eli's training not as a threat, but as a focal point of potential energy. He adjusted his earpiece, murmuring a quiet instruction to keep a respectful eye on the front row. In the press box, Reporter Tanya Rivers leaned toward her cameraman. "Make sure you get good footage of Norris," she whispered. "There's our headline right there." But as her eyes lingered on Chuck's expression, journalistic instinct prickled at the back of her neck. This wasn't the face of a celebrity enjoying the spotlight. This was the face of a man in quiet conflict. "Your breakthrough is coming." Joel's voice rose to a crescendo. "All you need is to accept God's plan without resistance. True faith means embracing suffering, knowing that pain is just God's blessing in disguise." Chuck's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly against his knees. "When life knocks you down," Joel continued, unaware of the subtle shift in the front row, "don't fight back. That's resistance to God's divine purpose." Deep lines appeared between Chuck's brows. The muscles in his jaw tensed beneath his beard. Across the sanctuary, thousands of voices agreed. Thousands of hands waved in surrender. But in the stillness between heartbeats, something fundamental was shifting, like the moment before an earthquake. When pressure builds against ancient fault lines, silent and invisible, until the ground finally breaks. The sermon soared toward its emotional peak. Joel moved across the stage with the precise choreography of a man who had mastered his environment, each gesture timed to the swell of background music, each pause perfectly placed for maximum impact. "When life strikes you on one cheek," he proclaimed, voice honeyed with compassion, "true believers don't strike back. They turn the other cheek. They surrender completely to God's plan." The words hung in the air like suspended crystal, beautiful and sharp. Chuck Norris felt each syllable like a physical weight. For 50 years he had lived by a different creed, one forged in combat rings and refined through disciplines that taught strength was not about domination, but protection. He had built his life around the principle that standing up against wrong wasn't resistance to divine will. It was fulfillment of moral duty. A memory surfaced unbidden. Vietnam, 1965. Young and scared, watching a village elder kneel before armed men, refusing to reveal where families had hidden. The old man had not fought back physically, but his silence, his refusal to yield what mattered most, had been the greatest act of courage Chuck had ever witnessed. That moment had defined his understanding of true strength. "Remember, friends," Joel continued, "when hardship comes, just smile and say, 'Thank you, Lord, for this trial.' Don't resist. Don't fight back. Just accept that this is God's plan for perfecting you." Something shifted in Chuck's expression, almost imperceptible. Yet Sarah Osteen caught it immediately. 20 years of reading audience reactions had attuned her to the subtle changes that preceded disruption. She glanced toward Eli, catching his eye with a small nod. The security chief straightened slightly, but remained in position. "The greatest faith," Joel proclaimed, voice rising toward revelation, "is passive acceptance. Those who fight against their circumstances fight against God Himself." Chuck's breathing deepened, his hands unclenched, laying flat against his knees. Around him, the congregation swayed in emotional surrender, many with eyes closed, tears streaming freely. Yet Chuck's eyes remained open, clear, and focused. In the press box, Tanya Rivers leaned forward, something in Chuck's demeanor triggering her reporter's instinct. "Zoom in on Norris," she whispered to her cameraman. "Something's happening." When Jesus faced his accusers, Joel's voice softened dramatically. Did he fight back? No. He accepted God's plan. And that's what we must do. Accept every blow, every setback, every tragedy as divine purpose, without question. The words echoed against the vaulted ceiling, amplified through speakers and broadcasts into millions of homes. Words that portrayed strength as surrender, courage as compliance. Sarah's unease crystallized into certainty. She moved closer to the edge of the stage, fingers brushing the microphone at her side, a contingency her husband might need if the moment fractured. So today, Joel's voice swelled with triumphant conclusion, I challenge you to stop fighting back against life's hardships. Stop resisting what comes against you. True faith means complete, unquestioning submission to. Chuck Norris stood. The motion was neither dramatic nor abrupt. There was no anger in the movement, no aggression, just the simple, deliberate act of a man rising to his feet in a room where everyone else remained seated. Yet in that context, against the backdrop of 15,000 passively receptive bodies, the single standing figure created a rupture in reality so profound that Joel's voice faltered mid-sentence. For 3 heartbeats, the church fell absolutely silent. The cameras, programmed to catch movement, swung toward Chuck like compass needles finding north. On massive screens throughout the sanctuary, his weathered face appeared calm, composed, neither hostile nor theatrical. Just present. Fully present. Joel blinked, words momentarily forgotten. In 20 years of ministry, no one had ever stood during his sermon unless invited to do so. Especially not someone of Chuck Norris's stature. Eli Vega's hand moved instinctively toward his earpiece. But something in Chuck's posture, the quiet dignity, the absence of threat, made him hesitate. A murmur rippled through the congregation like wind through wheat. Phones rose throughout the sanctuary, capturing the moment. Chuck neither spoke nor moved further. His stand itself was the statement. 15,000 faces turned toward him. 15,000 breaths held in collective anticipation. And across millions of screens, viewers leaned closer, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding in the cathedral of comfort. Something raw and true and unexpected. The moment balanced on a knife's edge between chaos and revelation. Time seemed suspended in the sanctuary's perfect stillness. Chuck Norris stood motionless, a solitary vertical line in a sea of seated worshippers. The silence stretched, heavy with possibility, until Joel cleared his throat, professional instinct taking over. Well, he said, voice wavering slightly before finding its practiced warmth. It seems we have a man of action among us today. His smile gleamed beneath the lights, attempting to reframe the disruption. Even legends stand for the word. Scattered laughter rippled through the congregation, uncertain and brief, but Chuck's expression remained unchanged, neither acknowledging the joke nor showing any sign of resuming his seat. His weathered face held no anger, no challenge, only quiet certainty, a physical embodiment of conviction. The moment expanded, filling the cavernous space with unspoken tension. For 20 years, Joel Osteen had masterfully controlled every aspect of his services, the lighting, the music, the emotional crescendos, the perfectly timed moments of revelation. Now, for the first time, an unscripted element had entered his carefully crafted world, and 15,000 people held their breath to see how he would respond. From her position at the edge of the platform, Sarah watched her husband's face, recognizing the subtle tightening around his eyes that signaled internal distress beneath his professional smile. She had seen that look only a handful of times in their marriage, always when Joel felt his carefully constructed narrative slipping beyond his control. Her gaze shifted to Chuck, noting not defiance in his posture but something rarer, absolute clarity of purpose. Across the sanctuary, thousands of phones recorded the unfolding drama. Social media platforms began lighting up with fragments of the broadcast. Something happening at Lakewood. Chuck Norris just stood up during Osteen's sermon. Is this a protest? In the third row, an elderly woman with silver hair slowly rose to her feet, her arthritic hands gripping the pew in front of her for support. Her face showed neither anger nor excitement, only quiet recognition, as though Chuck's stand had given form to something she had always felt but never expressed. A young man near the center aisle followed, then a middle-aged couple by the western entrance. Like wildflowers after rain, individuals throughout the congregation began to stand, not in mass, not as planned demonstration, but as separate acts of aligned conscience. Eli Vega remained poised at the sanctuary's edge, reading the situation with military precision. His training had prepared him for disruptions, the overwrought believer rushing the stage, the protester with an agenda, the mentally unstable seeking attention, but this was different. The absence of aggression in Chuck's posture kept him from intervening. Yet the potential for disruption hung in the air. He caught Sarah's eye again, both recognizing the delicate balance of the moment. "I think," Joel said, his smile tightening as more people stood throughout the sanctuary. "We're all feeling the Spirit move in a special way today." His voice carried the practiced cadence of a man accustomed to reframing unexpected situations into affirmations of his message. Sometimes God calls us to rise up, to stand firm in our faith. The words floated across the vast space, attempting to recapture the disruption as planned program. But something had shifted in the atmosphere, a current of authenticity that resisted packaging. The standing figures remained silent, creating islands of vertical witness throughout the seated crowd. Neither hostile nor performative, their presence created a visual counterpoint to the choreographed worship that had preceded this moment. Joel's smile tightened another notch as seconds passed and more people rose. The pause had stretched beyond his ability to incorporate it smoothly into the sermon's arc. Professional instinct told him to acknowledge the interruption directly, to name it before it named him. "Mr. Norris," he said, voice warm but pointed, "would you like to share something with us today?" The question traveled through the sound system, echoing against the vaulted ceiling. Thousands leaned forward, breath collectively held. On screens across the world, viewers witnessed the unscripted confrontation between polished prosperity and silent conviction. Chuck's response came after a measured pause, his voice level and clear without the microphone. "Some things need to be stood for." 5 words. Simple, direct, unembellished. Yet they landed with such weight that several people in the front rows visibly flinched. There was no aggression in his tone, only the quiet authority of absolute certainty. Joel's professional smile flickered. The disruption had evolved beyond easy recovery. In the press box, Tanya Rivers whispered urgently to her producer, "Are you getting this? This is the real story right here." A young mother in the family section stood, lifting her 5-year-old daughter to stand on the seat beside her. An elderly man with a veteran's cap pushed himself upright with trembling hands. A teenager in ripped jeans and a worship team t-shirt rose silently near the back wall. None spoke. None disrupted. They simply stood, a physical testament to something beyond words. Sarah moved to the edge of the platform, sensing the moment's importance. Her years beside Joel had attuned her to the subtle frequencies of authentic spiritual movement. This wasn't hysteria or performance or manipulation, the hallmarks she'd learned to recognize in 2 decades of ministry. This was something elemental. Something true. Of course, Joel attempted to reclaim narrative control, voice brightening. "We all must stand for our faith. That's exactly what I've been saying." "No." Chuck's single word cut through the sanctuary. Not shouted, not aggressive, but clear as a bell on a winter morning. "That's not what you've been saying." The congregation's collective intake of breath sounded like wind through a forest. On massive screens, cameras captured Joel's composure slipping for a fraction of a second before his training reasserted itself. In that brief, unguarded moment, viewers glimpsed something rarely seen beneath the polished veneer: uncertainty. Joel Osteen, master of the uplifting message, voice of unwavering optimism, suddenly faced a challenge he couldn't smile away. Across the sanctuary, more people rose. Not in uniform movement, but in individual decisions that somehow aligned into collective witness. A woman in medical scrubs, a businessman in a tailored suit, a grandmother with 3 teenage grandchildren. Within minutes, nearly 500 people stood scattered throughout the massive space, creating a visual counterpoint to Joel's message that no words could have articulated so powerfully. "I think there's a misunderstanding," Joel said, maintaining his smile though it no longer reached his eyes. "My message today is about embracing God's strength through our trials." Chuck remained unmoved, his weathered face calm. "Your message was to accept evil without resistance. That's not faith. That's surrender." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The words hung in the air, unadorned by rhetoric or emotion, yet powerful enough to send ripples of discomfort through the massive sanctuary. Several more people stood, not in protest but in dawning recognition, as though Chuck had articulated something they had felt but couldn't name. A middle-aged woman with tear-streaked cheeks rose shakily in the 10th row. "My husband beat me for 15 years. Her voice broke through the silence, trembling but clear. "My pastor told me to pray harder, to submit more fully." She looked directly at Chuck, then at Joel. "I finally left when I realized God wanted me strong, not broken." Her testimony hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. No camera had been planned for her, no microphone had been positioned to capture her words. Yet somehow her voice carried, perfectly audible in the hushed sanctuary. Joel's face flushed beneath the lights. For the first time in years, he found himself without a scripted response. The cameras captured his momentary vulnerability, broadcasting it to millions of viewers who had never seen the polished preacher at a loss. Near the eastern entrance, a man in his 60s stood. Military posture, evident despite his civilian clothes. "I watched a village burn in Vietnam because good men followed orders instead of conscience," he said, voice steady but lined with old pain. "Sometimes, faith means standing against what's wrong, not accepting it as God's will." The testimonies continued, rising from scattered points throughout the congregation. Short, unembellished, authentic. A social worker who intervened in abuse cases. A teacher who stood against bullying. A police officer who reported corruption within his department. Each story formed a counterpoint to Joel's message of passive acceptance, creating a spontaneous theology of active faith. In the silence that followed, Eli Vega made his decision. He stepped forward, not toward Chuck, but toward the center aisle, positioning himself as observer rather than enforcer. With deliberate calm, he reached up and removed his security earpiece, letting it hang loose around his neck, a small but significant gesture visible to the entire security team. His presence acknowledged the gravity of the moment without assigning blame or threat. "We're witnessing something holy," he whispered to the junior officer beside him. "Not a security issue, a truth issue." Joel stood frozen behind his podium. The polished rhythms of his sermon shattered beyond retrieval. The cameras captured his struggle, a man caught between the professional instinct to regain control and the spiritual pull toward authentic engagement. 20 years of ministry had taught him how to handle disruption, but not how to recognize revelation when it wore the face of interruption. Sarah moved closer to her husband, her hand brushing against his arm, not to pull him back from confrontation, but to anchor him in authenticity. Her touch conveyed what words could not. "This is real. Don't fight it. Listen." Throughout the sanctuary, the music team watched uncertainly from their position, instruments silent in their hands. The worship leader caught the eye of the pianist, who shook her head slightly. An instinctive recognition that no orchestrated sound should interrupt this moment of raw truth. The congregation held its breath, watching two forms of strength face off across the sanctified space, one gleaming with polish and prosperity, the other weathered by time and conviction. Nearly 1,000 people now stood throughout the sanctuary, creating a visual testament more powerful than any sermon could articulate. Chuck's eyes had never left Joel's face. His expression held neither triumph nor judgment, only the steady conviction of a man who had spent decades learning the difference between image and substance, between showing strength and being strong. "Your people aren't looking for comfort," Chuck said quietly, his voice somehow carrying to every corner of the massive space. "They're looking for courage. Don't sell them short." The statement hung in the air, simple yet profound. Joel's hands tightened on the podium edge as he faced the most critical choice of his ministry career, to defend his message or to hear the truth beneath the challenge. The moment stretched, taut as a wire, 15,000 breaths held in collective anticipation. Cameras captured every nuance, every micro-expression, broadcasting the unscripted confrontation to millions of viewers who sensed they were witnessing not a religious disagreement, but a fundamental clash of worldviews, comfort versus courage, appearance versus substance, easy answers versus difficult truths. In homes across America, viewers leaned toward their screens, instinctively recognizing the authenticity of the moment. Social media platforms exploded with real-time commentary. Something real happening at Lakewood. Osteen challenged by Norris. Most authentic church moment ever broadcast. The sanctuary waited in perfect stillness, the air electric with possibility, as two visions of faith faced each other across the divide between pulpit and pew. Behind each man stood their life's work, Joel's empire of positive messaging, Chuck's legacy of principled action. Before them stretched a choice that would define not just this moment, but the authenticity of their respective paths. In the suspended silence, even the cameras seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see which vision of faith would prevail, the gospel of comfort or the testament of courage. The moment balanced on a knife's edge between rehearsed certainty and raw truth, waiting for someone to choose which path the morning would take. Joel's hands tightened around the podium edge, his knuckles whitening beneath the spotlight. 20 years of ministry had taught him how to handle hecklers, skeptics, and emotional outbursts, but this was different. The challenge came not from the margins but from a man whose very life embodied discipline and integrity, whose silent stand carried the weight of earned authority. The cameras captured a moment rarely seen in Lakewood Church. Joel Osteen. Wordless. For 3 full seconds, the master communicator stood frozen, professional algorithms short-circuited by authentic disruption. Throughout the sanctuary, thousands leaned forward, sensing the weight of the unscripted moment. "Perhaps," Joel finally said, voice carefully modulated despite the tension visible in his shoulders, "you could share with us what you mean by that, Mr. Norris. We're all here to learn from each other." The invitation hung in the air, partly genuine, partly tactical. Around the sanctuary, phones captured every moment, every nuance of the unfolding drama. Social media feeds exploded with real-time commentary. Osteen challenged. Norris, standing for truth. Most authentic church moment ever broadcast. Chuck regarded Joel steadily, his weathered face revealing neither triumph nor anger, only the calm certainty of a man who had measured his words before speaking them. When he responded, his voice carried without effort, each word deliberate and measured. "You told them that faith means not fighting back, that resistance to evil is resistance to God." He paused, the lines in his face deepening with a lifetime of earned conviction. I've spent my life learning when to fight and when to stand down. The difference matters. From the press box, Tanya Rivers watched the interaction with journalistic instinct, on full alert. In 20 years of religious reporting, she had covered thousands of services, but never one where the carefully constructed narrative had fractured so completely, revealing something raw and unfiltered beneath. Her fingers flew across her phone, messaging her producer, "Stay on this. We're witnessing something historic." Murmurs rippled through the congregation like wind through wheat. On the live stream, comments flooded in by the thousands as viewers sensed they were witnessing something authentic and unplanned. In living rooms across America, people who had tuned in for comfortable inspiration found themselves transfixed by uncomfortable truth. Joel's smile thinned as he attempted to reclaim control of the narrative. The Bible tells us to turn the other cheek, to bless those who persecute us. It also tells us to protect the weak, Chuck interrupted, his calm unwavering. To stand against injustice, to speak truth even when it costs us. The theological contrast hung in the air, stark and uncompromising. Several dozen more people throughout the sanctuary rose to their feet, not in protest, but in silent agreement. The movement spread like ripples in still water, creating islands of vertical witness throughout the seated congregation. A woman in her 60s stood near the central aisle, her face lined with life's hardships yet dignified in purpose. "After Hurricane Harvey," she called out, voice trembling but clear, "I lost everything. I came to church for comfort. But what saved me wasn't accepting my loss. It was fighting to rebuild. Not just my home, but my neighbors' homes too." Her unplanned testimony echoed through the sanctuary. Before Joel could respond, a young man rose near the eastern entrance. "I survived addiction," he said simply. "Not by accepting it as God's will, but by fighting it with everything I had. Faith wasn't my comfort. It was my courage." The spontaneous testimonies continued, rising from scattered points throughout the massive sanctuary, brief, authentic moments of truth that formed a counterpoint to the prepared sermon. Joel stood frozen behind his podium, professional expertise offering no guidance for this unscripted reality. Sarah stepped forward, instinctively moving closer to her husband, while maintaining clear sight of Chuck. Her intuition told her this confrontation wasn't personal, it was principled, and principles required attention, not defense. "Joel," she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, "listen to what's happening. Really listen." Her words penetrated the haze of professional disorientation that had enveloped her husband. For perhaps the first time in years, Joel truly saw his congregation not as an audience to be inspired or a crowd to be moved, but as individuals with lived experiences that sometimes contradicted his polished messaging. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain footing on shifting ground. "With all due respect, Mr. Norris, I've studied scripture for decades." "So have I," Chuck replied simply. "But I've also studied life. I've seen what happens when good people stand by, when they mistake passivity for peace." The words landed with quiet force. In the press box, Tanya Rivers felt a chill run down her spine, recognizing the rare moment when practiced rhetoric meets lived truth and rhetoric falls short. Throughout the sanctuary, the standing witnesses had grown to nearly 2,000, a visible testament to the resonance of Chuck's challenge. They created a living counterpoint to Joel's message, not through shouted disagreement but through the simple power of bearing witness. Near the sound booth, a technician whispered to his colleague, "I've worked here 15 years. Never seen anything like this." His colleague nodded, fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted levels. "It's like watching the Emperor's new clothes in real time," she whispered back. Joel sensed the momentum shifting beneath his feet like quicksand. 2 decades of ministry had taught him to read a room, to sense the emotional current, and ride it toward his prepared conclusion. But this current was moving in an unfamiliar direction, carrying him toward uncharted territory. "Are you suggesting?" His voice took on an edge, defensive instinct overriding his practiced warmth. "That my teaching is false?" The question hung in the air, revealing more about Joel's state of mind than perhaps he intended. Throughout the sanctuary, people exchanged glances, sensing the critical juncture in what had become a public examination of faith's foundations. Chuck shook his head once, the motion barely perceptible. "I'm saying it's incomplete. You speak of a God who wants us comfortable. I know a God who wants us courageous." The distinction hung in the air, simple yet profound. Throughout the sanctuary, more people stood, 2,000, then 3,000, creating a visual testimony more powerful than words, not in confrontation but in recognition, as though a veil had been lifted from a truth they'd always sensed but couldn't articulate. From the back of the church, an elderly man rose shakily, supporting himself with a worn cane. "I fought at Normandy," he called out, his aged voice carrying surprising strength. "Not because it was comfortable, but because it was right. I prayed every step of the way across that beach, not for God to make it easy, but for God to make me strong enough to do what needed doing." The World War II veteran's testimony created a moment of profound silence. Even Joel seemed moved, his defensive posture softening slightly as he regarded the old soldier with genuine respect. Eli Vega watched the crowd with trained eyes, noting that what began as disruption was transforming into something else entirely, a moment of collective awakening. No threat to security, but perhaps a threat to complacency. He moved silently along the perimeter, positioning himself where he could observe both Chuck and Joel clearly, his military training recognizing the significance of witnessing history unfold. Joel gripped the podium tighter, professional veneer cracking under the weight of unexpected challenge. "My message has brought hope to millions," he said, voice rising defensively. "Who are you to question what God has blessed?" The words echoed harshly against the vaulted ceiling, revealing the wounded pride beneath the polished exterior. In their wake came a silence, so complete it seemed to have physical presence, a vacuum of expectation. Chuck's response, when it came, was quiet enough that the microphones barely caught it. Yet somehow it filled the entire sanctuary. "A servant," he said simply, "just like you." The humility in the statement disarmed Joel's defensiveness more effectively than any argument could have. His shoulders slumped slightly, the gesture barely perceptible except to those who knew him best. Throughout the sanctuary, people exchanged glances, some tearful, some nodding in recognition. The moment had transcended personality and touched something fundamental about faith itself. Sarah moved closer to her husband, recognizing the critical juncture. Her hand touched his arm gently, not pulling him back, but reminding him of who he was beneath the celebrity, beneath the brand, beneath the carefully constructed image of perfection. "It's okay to be human, Joel," she whispered, her voice carrying no further than his ear. "It's the only way to be truly strong." For 20 years, Sarah had watched her husband build an empire of inspiration, crafting a message that lifted spirits, but sometimes floated above life's harsher realities. She had seen the genuine heart beneath the polished performance, the man who truly wanted to help people but had become increasingly insulated from the very struggles that his congregation faced. In the silence, a young woman rose from the 10th row, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "Last year I lost my baby," she said, voice breaking. "And no matter how much I prayed, how much I surrendered, nothing made it better." She looked directly at Joel, then at Chuck. "What saved me wasn't accepting it as God's plan. It was finding the strength to live when I didn't want to. Finding purpose in pain by helping other mothers who suffered like me." Her raw testimony hung in the air, unanswerable by theology or platitudes. Joel stared at her. professional distance dissolving into genuine empathy. For perhaps the first time in years, he wasn't seeing a congregant or a follower, but a fellow human being whose experience challenged the neat parameters of his messaging. The congregation watched in stunned silence as something unprecedented unfolded on the stage. Joel Osteen, master of the uplifting message, found himself wordless before authentic challenge. In the silence, Chuck spoke once more, his voice gentle but clear. "Your message gives people hope. They need that." He paused, eyes steady, but hope without truth crumbles when life hits hardest. And life always hits hardest when we least expect it. The words settled across the sanctuary like morning dew. Quiet, nourishing, transformative. Joel stared at Chuck, professional mask completely fallen away, leaving only a man confronting an unexpected mirror. Tanya Rivers, watching from the press box, sensed the pivotal nature of the moment. In 2 decades of religious reporting, she had covered countless services, revivals, and faith gatherings. But she had never witnessed what was unfolding now. Not a choreographed spiritual moment, but an authentic one. Not a performance of faith, but faith itself being tested and refined in real time. "Keep the camera on both of them," she whispered urgently to her cameraman. "This isn't about personality anymore. It's about truth." Throughout the sanctuary, the standing witnesses had grown to nearly half the congregation. 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 people on their feet. Not in uniform movement, not as orchestrated demonstration, but as individual acts of recognition that had somehow aligned into collective testimony. Joel looked out over the sea of standing witnesses, something shifting in his expression. For 20 years, he had measured success by applause, by book sales, by the growth of his following. But the faces before him now offered something different, not adulation but authenticity, not performance but truth. In the press box, Tanya Rivers whispered into her phone, dictating the opening lines of what would become the most significant article of her career. Today at Lakewood Church, 2 visions of faith faced off across the divide between pulpit and pew. One built on comfort, one built on courage. What happened next transformed not just a sermon, but perhaps the future of American Christianity itself. The congregation held its breath, sensing that something profound was balancing on the knife edge of this moment. Not just a clash of personalities, but a collision of fundamental truths about faith, strength, and moral courage. Sarah moved closer to the edge of the platform, her intuition sensing the precipice on which her husband stood. The choice between defensiveness and growth, between image and integrity. "Joel," she said quietly, her voice carrying just far enough for him to hear, "remember why we started. It wasn't about the show, it was about the truth." Her words reached past the celebrity to the man she had married 2 decades earlier. The pastor with genuine passion, before the best-selling books, before the television contracts, before Lakewood had become an empire. Joel stared out at the congregation, then back at Chuck, the simple, dignified figure whose stand had cracked open the polished veneer of prosperity gospel to reveal the more complex reality of lived faith. In that moment of clarity, Joel faced the most significant choice of his ministry. To defend the brand he had built, or to embrace the truth that stood before him. The congregation waited. 15,000 breaths held in collective anticipation, as the morning balanced between rehearsed certainty and raw conviction. The silence hanging over Lakewood Church felt alive, charged with potential. 15,000 people watched, barely breathing, as Joel Osteen stood motionless behind his podium. The carefully constructed certainty of his world visibly shifting beneath him. The cameras captured every nuance of his expression, the subtle furrow between his brows, the slight tremor in his hands, the moment when polished confidence gave way to genuine vulnerability. Through the cavernous sanctuary, no sound could be heard except the gentle hum of the air conditioning system. Even the technicians in the sound booth held their positions, fingers frozen above controls, sensing that any movement might shatter the fragile moment unfolding before them. Joel stared at Chuck Norris, then at the thousands now standing throughout his congregation, not as orchestrated response to a preacher's call, but as individual acts of conscience that had somehow aligned into collective witness. The visual testimony before him spoke louder than any sermon he had ever delivered. Then, in a gesture no one could have predicted, Joel set his notes aside. Not dramatically, not as performance, but with the simple movement of a man setting down a burden. He stepped away from the podium, away from the script, away from 20 years of polished performance. He moved to the edge of the platform, microphone still in hand but lowered to his side, and looked directly at Chuck Norris. "Maybe," Joel said, voice hushed but captured perfectly by the sensitive microphone, "I've been too focused on comfort." The admission fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Throughout the sanctuary, people exchanged glances of disbelief. Never in the history of Lakewood Church had Joel Osteen departed from his message of unwavering optimism. Never had he acknowledged limitation or shortcoming in his approach to faith. A woman in the fourth row began to weep quietly. Her tears not of disappointment, but of recognition, as though something authentic had finally broken through the polished surface, something real enough to touch her own struggles. Chuck's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He inclined his head in acknowledgement, not of victory, but of courage. It took strength to admit weakness, especially before thousands. His weathered face reflected not triumph, but respect, the silent recognition one warrior gives another. From the back of the sanctuary, a spontaneous amen rose, not shouted in religious performance, but spoken in quiet affirmation. Others joined, the words spreading like gentle thunder throughout the massive space. Not the programmed response of a crowd following cues, but the organic recognition of truth acknowledged. Near the eastern entrance, Eli Vega relaxed his stance, recognizing that the moment of potential conflict had transformed into something entirely different. This was no longer a security concern, it was a turning point. He watched with the steady gaze of a man who had seen enough conflict to recognize genuine peace when it appeared not the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. In the press box, Tanya Rivers whispered to her cameraman, "Stay on both of them. Don't miss a second of this." Her journalistic instinct told her she was witnessing a rare moment of authentic transformation, the kind that happened once in a career if you were lucky. "Split screen," she added, eyes never leaving the unfolding scene. "We need to capture both men and the congregation's reaction." 20 years of religious reporting had attuned her to the difference between manufactured spiritual moments and genuine ones. This was the latter, unprogrammed, unorchestrated, real in a way that defied packaging. Joel took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling visibly beneath his tailored suit. For the first time that morning, perhaps for the first time in years, he abandoned the practiced cadences of his preaching voice. When he spoke again, the words came not from the charismatic televangelist, but from the man beneath the persona. "For 20 years," he said quietly, "I've told you that faith makes life easier." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, the imperfection, making him suddenly, startlingly, human. "I believed it. I still do. In some ways." He paused, gaze sweeping across the sea of standing witnesses, before returning to Chuck. "But maybe—" He hesitated, then continued with newfound courage. "Maybe true faith isn't about easy. Maybe it's about right." A ripple moved through the congregation. Not applause. Not yet, but a collective intake of breath, a recognition that something genuine was unfolding before them. From her position at the edge of the stage, Sarah watched her husband with tears streaming unchecked down her face. For years, she had loved the man beneath the persona, catching glimpses of the authentic Joel in private moments. Now, for the first time, she was watching her husband and her pastor become the same person before thousands of witnesses. Chuck remained standing, his weathered face solemn yet somehow gentler than before. Around him, others who had risen remained on their feet, creating islands of vertical stillness throughout the seated crowd. Their presence formed a silent affirmation more powerful than any spoken words could have been. Joel stepped down from the platform, an act unprecedented in Lakewood's history. The physical descent from pulpit to floor level carried symbolic weight that was lost on no one. He moved not with the confident stride of a man accustomed to commanding attention, but with the humbler gait of someone approaching truth rather than audience. He stopped a few feet from Chuck, close enough for conversation but maintaining respectful distance. The cameras followed, capturing the moment when prosperity gospel met, lived faith on equal ground. "I've spent my ministry telling people that God wants them happy," Joel said, his voice carrying without the need for performance now. "And he does. But maybe I've confused comfort with joy, ease with peace." The distinction hung in the air, theological in content, but deeply personal in delivery. Throughout the sanctuary, ministers and longtime church members exchanged glances, recognizing the seismic shift occurring before them. In the sound booth, a technician whispered to his colleague, "Should we cue worship music?" The question reflected the instinct to frame and package the moment, to return it to familiar programming. His supervisor shook her head firmly. "Not now. This is real. Let it breathe." Joel turned to face his congregation directly, no longer performing for them, but speaking to them as equals. "How many of you," he asked quietly, "have faced something so dark, so painful, that my message of positive thinking felt?" He hesitated, searching for honest words rather than polished phrases. "Felt insufficient?" Throughout the sanctuary, hands began to rise. Slowly at first, then in growing numbers. Hundreds, then thousands. Not raised in worship or in response to an altar call, but in simple, honest acknowledgement of lived struggle that transcended positive platitudes. Joel's breath caught visibly as he witnessed the response. The cameras captured the moment when recognition dawned in his eyes, the realization that the very people who filled his church each week, who bought his books and followed his broadcasts, carried wounds deeper than his message had acknowledged. "I'm sorry," he said simply. 2 words. Unscripted, unplanned, perhaps unprecedented, in the context of a Lakewood service. They hung in the air, powerful in their humility, transformative in their authenticity. From the 15th row, a middle-aged man called out, voice thick with emotion, "We don't need perfect, Pastor Joel. We need real." The sentiment echoed through the sanctuary, drawing murmurs of agreement. Joel nodded, absorbing the truth of it, his usual camera-ready smile replaced by something more genuine, less dazzling but more human. He turned back to Chuck, who had observed the exchange in characteristic silence. "Would you?" Joel hesitated, then continued with newfound humility. "Would you share what you've learned about when to stand and when to surrender?" The invitation hung in the air, unexpected and sincere. Chuck considered it for a long moment, his expression thoughtful beneath his beard. Then he nodded once, not in eagerness, but in recognition of responsibility accepted. He moved forward, not rushing but deliberate, until he stood at the steps leading to the platform. The physical space between them had closed, but more importantly, The philosophical distance had narrowed as well. Sarah moved to meet him, offering a wireless microphone with a smile that contained both welcome and gratitude. Their eyes met briefly, acknowledgement passing between them of the importance of this unscripted moment. "Thank you," she whispered. The words meant for Chuck alone. He needed this. We all did. Chuck accepted the microphone with a nod of acknowledgement, his movements economical and precise. No wasted gesture, no performance, only purpose. Standing at the junction between platform and congregation, belonging fully to neither space, he surveyed the thousands of expectant faces. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet gravity of hard-earned wisdom. "I'm no preacher," he began, "and I don't claim to know God's mind better than anyone here." The humility in the statement stood in stark contrast to his legendary status. "But I've lived long enough to learn a few things about strength and surrender." Throughout the sanctuary, people leaned forward, drawn by the authenticity in his voice. Even those watching via live stream sensed the shift from performance to truth. In living rooms across America, viewers who had tuned in for comfortable inspiration found themselves receiving something different, not easy answers, but honest wisdom. There are times to accept what comes: pain, loss, the things we can't change. Chuck's eyes swept across the congregation, seeing not a crowd but individuals. That takes one kind of strength. But there are also times to stand against what's wrong, to protect those who can't protect themselves, to speak truth when lies are easier. He paused, the lines in his face deepening. That takes another kind of strength. Knowing the difference, that's wisdom. The words settled across the sanctuary, like gentle rain on parched ground. Not the adrenaline rush of emotional manipulation that often characterized revival meetings, but the quieter nourishment of truth recognized. Joel stood nearby, listening with an openness that transformed his familiar face. For the first time in years, he was not performing or teaching but learning, publicly and without pretense. "Faith isn't a shield from life's battles," Chuck continued, his voice steady and clear. "It's the courage to fight the right ones, for the right reasons, and sometimes," his voice softened, "sometimes, faith is the strength to endure what can't be fought. The wisdom is knowing which is which." An elderly woman near the back stood shakily, tears streaming down lined cheeks. "My husband died of cancer last year," she called out, voice trembling with emotion. "I prayed for healing every day. It didn't come." She paused, gathering strength, but something else did. The courage to be with him, to the end. To love him through pain I couldn't fix. Chuck nodded in solemn recognition of her testimony. "That's the kind of strength that doesn't make headlines," he affirmed. "But it's the kind that holds the world together." Throughout the sanctuary, people nodded in recognition. Some wiped away tears. Others exchanged glances of deep understanding, as though an essential truth had been articulated that they had always sensed but never heard spoken aloud in this context. A young man stood near the central aisle, his face bearing the marks of recent grief. "I lost my brother to addiction," he said, voice breaking. "For years I blamed myself for not saving him. I thought faith meant I should have been stronger, should have found the right words, the right actions." He looked directly at Chuck, then at Joel. "What's helping me heal isn't pretending I could have fixed it. It's finding the strength to carry his memory with love instead of guilt." His testimony hung in the air, unanswerable by platitudes. Joel moved toward him, not as celebrity pastor but as fellow human. "Thank you," he said simply, "for your honesty, for teaching us." The interaction captured the transformation unfolding in real time. The shift from a church where truth flowed in one direction, from pulpit to pew, to one where authentic experience was recognized as equally valuable. equally sacred. Chuck handed the microphone back to Sarah with a slight bow of respect. He returned to his place in the front row but remained standing, not in protest now, but in witness. Around the sanctuary, others who had risen also remained on their feet, creating a powerful visual testament to truth acknowledged. Joel returned to the podium, transformed, not defeated, but deepened. The cameras captured the subtle change in his posture, the newfound authenticity in his expression as he surveyed his congregation with fresh eyes. "I think," he said quietly, "we've all been given a gift today." He glanced toward Chuck with genuine gratitude. A reminder that real faith has backbone, that God doesn't just want our praise, He wants our courage. For the first time that morning, the applause that swept through Lakewood Church wasn't prompted or performed. It rose spontaneously, a genuine response to genuine truth. In the press box, Tanya Rivers felt tears prick behind her professional mask. "Now that," she whispered to no one in particular, "is the sermon America needed." The spontaneous applause continued, building not to the orchestrated crescendo of a typical Lakewood service, but to something more organic, more authentic, the sound of truth recognized and embraced. As the applause gradually subsided, a transformation was visible throughout the sanctuary. Not the surface-level emotional high that typically characterized the conclusion of Joel's sermons, but something deeper and more lasting, the shift from inspiration to conviction, from performance to purpose. The morning had begun with a message about accepting circumstances as divine will. It was transforming into a recognition that sometimes the most faithful act is to stand against what is wrong, not with violence or anger, but with the quiet courage that comes from unshakable conviction. Throughout the sanctuary, people who had never met began to turn to one another, sharing stories, acknowledging struggles, offering support not through platitudes, but through presence. The carefully maintained veneer of prosperity polish had cracked, revealing the more complex, more beautiful reality of authentic community beneath. Sarah caught Joel's eye from the edge of the platform, her gaze filled with pride and love. Not for the charismatic preacher who filled stadiums, but for the man willing to grow in public, to acknowledge limitation, to embrace a deeper truth even when it challenged his carefully constructed narrative. The cameras continued to roll, capturing not the conclusion of a sermon, but the beginning of a transformation, one whose ripples would extend far beyond this single Sunday morning, far beyond the walls of Lakewood Church. In living rooms across America, viewers who had tuned in expecting the familiar comfort of prosperity gospel found themselves witnesses to something rarer and more valuable. The moment when performance gave way to authenticity, when doctrine bowed to wisdom, when truth was acknowledged, not despite the cost, but because of the value. And at the center of it all stood two men, one who had built an empire on messages of comfort, one who had lived a life of principled action, no longer representing competing visions of faith, but complementary aspects of a more complex, more honest spirituality. The energy in Lakewood Church had transformed. What began as polished performance had cracked open to reveal something raw and real beneath. As Joel returned to the podium, his famous smile appeared but changed, humbled, more genuine than practiced. The cameras caught the subtle difference, broadcasting not just the words that would follow but the transformation itself to millions of viewers. "I had a sermon prepared today," he admitted, gesturing toward his abandoned notes with a rueful shake of his head, "about comfort and prosperity and easy blessings." He paused, meeting Chuck's steady gaze across the divide that now seemed smaller than before. "But I think God had a different message in mind." A murmur of agreement rippled through the congregation. The massive screens displayed both men, Joel behind his podium, Chuck standing in quiet dignity among the congregation. Two forms of strength, no longer in opposition but in harmony, each illuminating the other. From the eastern entrance, A shaft of sunlight broke through the carefully controlled lighting scheme, cutting across the sanctuary at an angle that seemed almost deliberate. It highlighted the thousands still standing throughout the massive space. Not uniform or orchestrated, but individual acts of witness that had somehow aligned into collective testimony. For years, Joel continued, voice stripped of its performative polish, I've preached about a God who wants you comfortable. But today I'm reminded that sometimes the greatest comfort God offers is the strength to be uncomfortable for the right reasons. He paused, the words settling across the sanctuary. In that moment, he looked less like the polished televangelist and more like the young pastor who had started with nothing but conviction before the bestsellers, before the television contracts, before Lakewood had become an empire. Comfort isn't wrong, he continued, finding his way through unfamiliar territory, without script or teleprompter. God does want to bless us. But perhaps I've confused blessing with ease, prosperity with purpose. Throughout the sanctuary, hundreds more rose to their feet. Not in the choreographed movement of a typical service, but in spontaneous recognition of truth. Parents lifted children to see. Elderly worshippers braced against pews, but stood nonetheless. A wave of silent witness spread through the massive space. In the sound booth, technicians exchanged glances of wonder. Should we cut to commercial? One whispered. Protocol suggesting the scheduled programming break. The director shook her head firmly. Not now, she whispered back. This is real. Let it run. On screens across America, viewers who had tuned in for familiar inspiration found themselves witnessing something unprecedented, not just in Lakewood's history, but in the broader landscape of televised religion. A moment when the carefully constructed narrative of prosperity gospel confronted the messier reality of authentic faith and chose truth over brand. Sarah Osteen watched from the side platform, tears streaming unchecked down her face. For years, she had loved the man beneath the persona, catching glimpses of the authentic Joel in private moments. Now, for the first time, she was watching her husband and her pastor become the same person before thousands of witnesses. When I started ministry, Joel continued, voice gaining strength not through volume but through authenticity, it wasn't about this. He gestured to the massive sanctuary, the cameras, the production values that had become Lakewood's trademark. It was about helping people find God in their darkest moments. The admission hung in the air, simultaneously humble and powerful. Throughout the congregation, people nodded in recognition both of the truth spoken and the courage it took to speak it. Somewhere along the way, Joel continued, I think I started believing that the answer to darkness was to pretend it wasn't there, to smile bigger, to speak more positively, to focus only on blessing. He shook his head slightly. But real faith doesn't ignore the darkness. It faces it, with the courage that comes from knowing you're not alone in it. Near the back wall, a woman in medical scrubs wiped tears from her eyes. 10 years as a nurse, she whispered to her companion. I've been waiting to hear a pastor acknowledge that sometimes life is just hard, and that's okay. Eli Vega stood at attention, not from security concerns but from respect. As a Marine, he recognized the moment when performance gave way to mission, when what mattered wasn't appearance, but purpose. His hand moved instinctively to his chest in a gesture of silent salute, acknowledging not rank or position but integrity recognized. In the press box, Tanya Rivers worked frantically, knowing that the story had completely transformed. This wasn't a celebrity disruption or a theological dispute. This was a rare moment of public authenticity that transcended religious boundaries, a story about courage and conviction in an age starved for both. This isn't just church news, she whispered to her producer over the phone. This is cultural. Get me on the evening broadcast. 20 years of religious reporting had taught her to recognize the difference between manufactured spiritual moments and genuine ones. This was the latter raw, unfiltered, transformative. Joel looked out over his congregation, seeing them with new clarity, not as an audience to be impressed or a crowd to be moved, but as individuals with complex lives, genuine struggles, and a hunger for truth that transcended comfortable platitudes. Chuck Norris didn't stand up today to challenge my authority, he said, voice gaining strength through humility rather than volume. He stood up to remind us all what authority really means. Not fame, not followers, but the courage to stand for truth, even when you stand alone. Chuck remained motionless, his weathered face solemn, yet somehow at peace. His purpose had been fulfilled, not through confrontation but through catalyst, the pebble that starts the avalanche, the spark that ignites transformation. So today, Joel continued, I'm changing my message. Instead of asking what God can do for you, I'm asking what God is calling you to stand for. What truth needs your courage? What injustice needs your voice? What wrong have you accepted that God is actually calling you to challenge? The questions hung in the air, electric with possibility. Throughout the sanctuary, people turned to each other, conversations breaking out in whispers that grew to a gentle roar of awakening. Strangers became neighbors, shared struggles creating bridges across social divides that had remained intact through years of services. Without prompting, the worship team began to play softly. Not the triumphant praise music that typically accompanied Joel's sermons, but something quieter, more reflective. A woman's voice rose in simple melody. Give me strength to stand. The song spread organically through the congregation, building not in volume, but in conviction. 15,000 voices joined together, not in mindless repetition, but in genuine prayer. A young mother near the central aisle lifted her son to her shoulders, the boy's eyes wide with wonder at the sea of standing people. What's happening? He whispered. His mother smiled through tears. People are remembering what matters, she answered simply. Across the sanctuary, a teenager who had been dragged to church by parents turned off his phone, slipping it into his pocket as he stood alongside them. The cynicism that had been his shield against superficial religion couldn't withstand the authenticity of the moment. Near the sound booth, two deacons who had served at Lakewood for 15 years embraced, the moment breaking through years of professional distance. This, one whispered, is what we signed up for in the beginning. In the midst of this transformation, Chuck Norris quietly collected his Bible and began to move toward the exit. His stand completed, his witness given, he sought no personal acclaim. The humility in the gesture spoke as clearly as his earlier courage. This had never been about him, only about truth. But Joel saw him. Wait, he called, voice cutting through the music. The congregation fell silent as Joel descended from the platform for the second time that morning, crossing the space that separated pulpit from pew, performance from participation. He approached Chuck with hands outstretched, not for cameras but for connection. The two men stood face to face, the polished preacher and the weathered warrior, equals in the moment of truth. Thank you, Joel said simply, his voice carrying without amplification through the hushed sanctuary, for the courage to stand when it would have been easier to stay seated. Chuck clasped his hand firmly. The gesture containing neither triumph nor judgment, only recognition between men who had glimpsed the same truth from different paths. Courage isn't about fighting, Chuck replied quietly. It's about standing for what matters, even when it costs you. The words passed between them, but the microphones caught them, broadcasting this intimate exchange to millions. Not a staged moment for cameras, but a genuine connection captured by them. Will you stay? Joel asked, the question containing layers of meaning beyond the immediate mourning. Not as a celebrity guest, but as a brother? I think we all have more to learn. Chuck considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. The lines in his face deepened, not with age but with the weight of decision. Finally, he nodded once. Yes, he answered simply. Not at the podium, but in the journey. The exchange, brief but profound, captured the essence of the transformation unfolding. Not a transfer of spotlight from one figure to another, but a fundamental shift from hierarchy to community, from performance to authenticity. As Chuck turned again to leave, the congregation rose in united respect, not the frenzy of celebrity worship, but the solemn acknowledgement of truth recognized. No applause, no shouting. Just the quiet dignity of 15,000 people standing for something real. Joel watched him go, then turned back to his congregation with new eyes. I've been your pastor for 20 years, he said, voice carrying without artificial energy. But today, I feel like I'm just beginning to understand what that really means. The admission contained no shame, only the genuine humility of a man who had glimpsed a deeper truth than the one he had been teaching. For years, I've asked you to trust my vision of faith, he continued. Today, I'm asking us to journey together toward something truer. Not a faith that promises escape from life's hardest moments, but one that offers courage to face them. Not a God who shields us from pain, but one who stands with us through it. Throughout the sanctuary, people nodded in recognition, both of the message and the messenger's transformation. This was not the carefully scripted optimism they had come to expect, but something more complex, more demanding, and ultimately, more authentic. I don't have all the answers, Joel admitted, the words unprecedented in his ministry. But I'm willing to ask harder questions, to listen more than I speak, to learn from your courage as much as I hope to inspire it. In the press box, Tanya Rivers hastily rewrote her entire story. The headline that would flash across networks within the hour: Chuck Norris stands, Joel Osteen listens. A moment of authentic faith stuns Lakewood Church. Outside the sanctuary, as Chuck slipped quietly through side doors to avoid the press, he found Sarah Osteen waiting. No cameras recorded their brief exchange. He needed that, she said simply. We all did. Truth before comfort. Chuck nodded once, the motion containing volumes. He's a good man, he replied. Good enough to recognize when God's speaking through interruption. Sarah smiled, eyes still damp with tears. Will you come back? Chuck considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. Yes, he finally answered. Not as a celebrity, as a brother. The distinction spoke volumes about the transformation underway, not just in Joel or in Lakewood, but in the understanding of what church itself could be. Not a performance venue for charismatic figures, but a community of equals seeking truth together, each voice valued, each struggle acknowledged. Sarah touched his arm briefly in silent gratitude, then turned back toward the sanctuary, where her husband was bringing the unprecedented service to a close. Today we witnessed what faith looks like with backbone, Joel told the still-standing congregation. Not angry, not loud, but unshakable when truth is at stake. He paused, eyes sweeping across the thousands before him. Go be that kind of believer, the kind that stands up. The words hung in the air, both benediction and commission. Throughout the sanctuary, people reached for each other, hands clasping across pews, eyes meeting in recognition, silent promises forming between strangers who had somehow become community through shared witness. As people began to move toward the exits, the conversation that filled Lakewood Church wasn't about celebrity sightings or comfortable platitudes. It was about courage, about conviction, about the strength to stand. An elderly couple who had attended Lakewood for 15 years walked slowly toward the parking lot, hands clasped. "First time," the woman said quietly. "I felt like bringing my cancer diagnosis to church. Always felt like I had to leave the hard stuff at the door before." Her husband squeezed her hand. "Maybe now we can bring our whole selves, not just the Sunday morning version." Near the western entrance, a group of teenagers huddled together, phones forgotten in their hands. "You know what was crazy?" one said to his friends. "How it wasn't crazy. No lightning, no drama, just truth." His friend nodded. "Made me think there might be something real to this faith stuff after all. Not the Instagram version, the stand-up version." Outside, news vans had already gathered, alerted by the viral clips spreading across social media. The story was exploding across platforms. Chuck Norris takes a stand during Osteen's sermon. Joel Osteen's humbling moment, when faith meets courage. But beyond the headlines and sound bites, something more profound had shifted. In living rooms across America, viewers who had witnessed the unscripted moment found themselves asking uncomfortable questions about comfortable faith, about the difference between positive thinking and moral courage, about what it means to stand for truth in a world that prefers easy answers. A pastor in a small Minnesota church sat stunned before his television. Sunday sermon notes abandoned beside him. 20 years. Preaching prosperity, he whispered to his empty study. What if I've been wrong? The question wasn't defeat, but awakening, the beginning of a journey toward something truer than success. A woman in an Arizona retirement community wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the broadcast. Memories of her own silent stands flooding back, the time she'd defended a bullied neighbor, the day she'd spoken truth to a corrupt boss, the moment she'd chosen costly integrity over comfortable compromise. "That's it," she whispered to her empty living room. "That's what faith was always meant to be." And in churches across the nation, pastors who had built careers on prosperity promises felt a tremor run through their carefully constructed foundations. The first rumbling of an awakening that began with one man, standing when it would have been easier to remain seated. Inside Lakewood, after the crowds had dispersed, Joel walked the empty sanctuary alone. His footsteps echoed against the vaulted ceiling as he moved to the spot where Chuck had stood. For a long moment, he simply remained there, feeling the weight of the morning's transformation. Sarah found him there, her hand slipping naturally into his. "You okay?" she asked simply. Joel considered the question with uncharacteristic thoughtfulness. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "But I think that might be a good thing." She nodded, understanding the journey ahead, the complexity of rebuilding ministry around harder truths, the courage required to choose authenticity over brand, the inevitable pushback from those invested in the simpler message. "It won't be easy," she said quietly. Joel smiled, not the dazzling camera-ready smile that had become his trademark, but something quieter and more genuine. "No," he agreed. "But it will be true." As they walked together toward the exit, the empty sanctuary held the echo of the morning's transformation. The moment when performance had given way to purpose, when comfort had yielded to courage, when truth had broken through the polished surface of prosperity to reveal the deeper foundation beneath. Outside, evening light cast long shadows across the parking lot as the last staff members departed. The massive Lakewood logo gleamed in the sunset, unchanged in form, but transformed in meaning. Because truth, once witnessed, cannot be unwatched. And courage, once demonstrated, calls forth courage in others. Sometimes, it begins with simply standing up. In homes across the nation, people who had witnessed the morning's transformation continued the conversation at dinner tables, in text messages, through phone calls to friends and family. Not analyzing celebrity drama, but wrestling with fundamental questions about faith and courage, about what it means to stand for truth in a world that often prefers comfortable illusions. And in a quiet hotel room across town, Chuck Norris knelt in private prayer. Not the showy devotion of religious performance, but the genuine communion of a man who understood that true strength comes from something deeper than self. The next Sunday's service at Lakewood would see record attendance, not drawn by celebrity or spectacle, but by hunger for the authenticity glimpsed in that unscripted moment when a legend stood up, a pastor listened, and the carefully constructed narrative of prosperity gospel gave way to something truer and more demanding. Because faith, at its core, isn't about escaping life's hardships through positive thinking. It's about finding the courage to face them with integrity, to stand for truth when compromise would be easier, to live with backbone when the world prefers spineless comfort. Sometimes, the most faithful act isn't saying, Amen. Sometimes, it's standing up. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.